The history we learn in school about World War I is one of trenches, artillery, brave soldiers, and unspeakable horrors. But what if I told you that behind the smoke and bloodshed, another, far more secret, and perhaps even more decisive, war was being fought? A war not with bayonets and barbed wire, but in gold reserves, bond markets, in the shadowy offices of bankers and the halls of central banks. While millions of young men paid with their lives on the battlefield, governments and financiers were busy calculating balance sheets, moving unimaginable sums of money. And what they did in those years didn't just decide who won or lost the conflict. It also reconfigured the global financial system in ways that, believe it or not, still hold you captive today. If you think war is only about politics and armies, think again. World War I proved that money is a weapon, and one of the most lethal ever invented. Surprisingly, this crucial lesson is rarely taught. The truth today: debt as an inescapable choice. In 1914, Europe was a powder keg. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and military alliances had turned the continent into a paranoid chessboard. Yet behind all the talk of honor and empire lay a brutal financial reality. A war on this scale was impossible without unfathomable sums of money. And here's the stark truth, one that still rings true today. When leaders choose war, they're also choosing debt. Every empire that sent its troops to the front lines was simultaneously pushing its people toward a future of heavy economic burdens. At first, many governments believed the war would be over quickly, maybe by Christmas. They thought they could pay for it the old-fashioned way, with gold, limited loans, and patriotic donations. But within weeks, that illusion shattered. The war was burning through cash faster than anyone could have imagined. And that cash burn is the origin of many of the problems you face today. The great turning point, the end of the anchor and the birth of faith in paper. Let's be precise. In the summer of 1914, the European financial system still revolved around the gold standard. Nations promised that their paper money could be exchanged for physical gold. This system gave currencies credibility, but also tied governments' hands. Gold reserves were finite. You couldn't just print money indefinitely without losing the trust of your people and your creditors. The UK, France, and Germany had respectable reserves, but when millions of men were mobilized and industries were redirected to armaments, costs skyrocketed. Germany alone was spending over 10 million marks a day by late 1914. The UK's war costs would soon reach £2.5 million a day. The math was brutal. The gold wouldn't last. So governments suspended the rules. One by one, the major powers abandoned the gold standard, silently admitting to their citizens that money was now, essentially, a promise backed by nothing more than faith in the state. And that moment, the breaking of the gold anchor, was one of the most important financial shifts in modern history. It exposed the fragility of a nation's so-called real wealth. From then on, money and power were unlinked from metal and driven by printing presses, credit, and sheer persuasion. Once governments had a taste of that freedom to create money, they never looked back. Here lies the seed of the inflation and public debt we know today. How the powers paid the bill. A lesson on who always pays. From that moment, the financial war began in earnest, and each nation pursued its own strategy, with outcomes you'll recognize in today's economic cycles. The German strategy: patriotism and ruin, isolated from global capital markets and blockaded by the Royal Navy. Germany's only option was massive domestic borrowing. Berlin launched gigantic bond sale campaigns, appealing to patriotism and urging ordinary citizens to pour their life savings into war loans. The propaganda was relentless. Posters of heroic soldiers, families told to sacrifice luxuries for the fatherland, and constant promises that investors would be repaid after victory. In total, Germany raised over 100 billion marks this way, but it was a pyramid built on hope. When defeat came, those bonds became worthless. Millions of Germans saw their life savings wiped out, and that bitterness, as we know, became fertile ground for extremism in the following decades. Economic history always leaves scars, and the little guy always bleeds first. A painful truth many of you feel echoed today. The American rise from debtor to world creditor. The UK had an immense advantage. The City of London was the world's financial centre. The pound was trusted, and British networks reached across the globe. Initially, the British government turned to short-term loans and patriotic appeals, but very soon it dove into the deeper waters of global credit. Crucially, it turned to the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral, but its bankers smelled opportunity. Firms like J.P. Morgan & Co. became the financial lifeline for Britain and France, arranging vast loans and managing purchases of arms, food, and raw materials. By 1917, when America itself entered the war, Wall Street had been funding the Allied cause for years. This wasn't charity, this was power. American bankers made millions in fees, and the US emerged from the war transformed, from a debtor nation to a creditor nation, from a financial follower to a global leader. If you've ever wondered how the 20th century became the American century, it started here, not on the battlefields, but in the ledgers. France and Russia, the fragility of dependency. France faced its own dilemmas. Already weakened by defense costs and scarred by the memory of the Franco-Prussian War, it relied heavily on loans, both domestic and international, coming again in large part from across the Atlantic. France, like Britain, grew increasingly dependent on American capital. This dependency would shape post-war politics as debts mounted and repayment became a source of tension. Russia's financial war, on the other hand, was a total disaster. The empire was vast but underdeveloped, its banking system fragile, and its gold reserves impressive on paper but insufficient in practice. To fund its war effort, Russia borrowed heavily from its allies, particularly France. But as defeats mounted and inflation skyrocketed, faith in the ruble collapsed. By 1917, the Russian economy was in ruins, and the political system went with it. The collapse of the Tsarist regime wasn't just about ideology or bad generals. It was about a financial system stretched to the breaking point. Economic blunders, monetary chaos, and inflation helped fuel the revolution. Once again, money and power marched together into history. The chilling connection, the financial playbook that never changed. The scale of the financial missteps and successes was staggering. By the end of the war, Allied powers had spent over $140 billion, while the Central Powers spent about $60 billion. These were sums the world had never seen, equivalent to many times the combatants' total pre-war national income. The result was not only mountains of debt, but also the destruction of the old financial order. The gold standard, once the foundation of global trust, was shattered. Inflation tore through economies. Germany would soon face hyperinflation, so extreme that a loaf of bread would cost billions of marks. And the common people, workers, savers, small investors, were the ones who paid the price. Meanwhile, the wealthy elites often protected themselves by moving assets abroad, buying real goods, or staying close to the centers of power where information leaked first. The lesson was brutal but clear. In a financial war, the price is paid by us, the ordinary citizens. And here is the connection that matters to you today, the one many of you are hungry to understand. World War I was the moment governments learned they could fund the unimaginable by unlinking money from reality. They discovered they could suspend the gold peg, print money non-stop, issue bonds to their own citizens, borrow across borders, and then fix the mess with propaganda and restructuring. Sound familiar? That's because the playbook never went away. Every modern crisis, from the Great Depression to the 2008 global financial crash, carries echoes of 1914. When governments or central banks insist this is temporary, that the fundamentals are solid, remember that in 1914 they were saying the same thing, and millions believed them until the currency in their hands was worth nothing. The new financial map and sowing the next crisis. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world looked like a battlefield, not just in the trenches, but on the balance sheets. The United States, which was a debtor nation before the war, now held the world's largest gold reserves and the biggest creditor position in history. Europe, the old heart of global finance, was drowning in debt. The UK owed the US over $4 billion, France owed over $3 billion, and even smaller nations were entangled in obligations they could never realistically pay. The war had transformed Wall Street into the planet's new financial capital, displacing London in a way no cannon could have achieved. The era of American dominance in money and power had begun, but this wasn't a smooth transition, because here is the trap that repeats in every debt cycle. When wars are funded by loans, the repayment becomes a war of its own. Britain and France, desperate to maintain the faith of their citizens who had bought war bonds, now had to squeeze money from Germany in the form of reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an astronomical sum, 132 billion gold marks. It was meant to punish, to cripple, and to transfer the burden to the defeated. But it was also a fantasy. Germany simply couldn't pay. Every attempt to do so, whether by printing money or transferring goods, further destabilized its economy. The hyperinflation of 1923, when Germans carried wheelbarrows of worthless banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread, was no accident. It was the direct consequence of a financial system pushed to its limit by impossible debts, and it planted seeds of anger that extremists would later harvest. Meanwhile, the UK tried to restore its financial prestige by returning to the gold standard in 1925, fixing the pound at its old pre-war value. But this was another economic blunder of frightening proportions. The British economy had been devastated, its industrial base weakened, its debts enormous. Restoring the pound to its old parity was like forcing a broken limb back into place without healing it first. The result was deflation, unemployment, and unrest. The policy, championed by figures like Winston Churchill, is today remembered as one of the worst financial miscalculations in modern economic history. And once again, the ordinary workers were the ones who paid. The United States, with its abundant gold and credit, faced a different challenge: what to do with its new dominance. American banks began to pump money back into Europe, lending to Germany so that Germany could pay reparations to Britain and France, who could in turn pay their debts to America. It was a financial merry-go-round that looked stable on the surface, but was built on a circular logic of debt upon debt. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 institutionalized this flow. Money was being recycled, not created, and when the global economy shuddered in the Great Depression, the whole structure came crashing down. The world had never been so financially interconnected and never so fragile. The key to your freedom: how to understand the game and win. This is why World War I is not just another chapter in military history. It was a turning point in economic history, where financial blunders and illusions reshaped the future. The war showed that governments could abandon gold, inflate currencies, and borrow on an unprecedented scale, and still persuade their citizens they were doing the right thing. It proved that propaganda could turn debt into patriotism, that ordinary savers could be convinced to hand over their wealth for bonds that would never be repaid, and that the real winners of the war were often those sitting in boardrooms, not those fighting in the trenches. Money and power were fused more tightly than ever before, and the world has lived with the consequences ever since. Now, think about your life today. When central banks promise that inflation is transitory, when governments expand debt ceilings year after year, when new money is conjured digitally with the flick of a switch, remember 1914. Remember that the gold standard wasn't abandoned by accident, but by a desperate design. Remember that the pattern of borrowing against the future, of printing to cover the present, of selling bonds with patriotic slogans, is more than a century old. Every financial crisis of the modern era has roots in those war years. From the stagflation of the 1970s to the subprime collapse of 2008, the same illusions are still at play, and the same people, the common saver, the middle-class worker, the small investor, are still the ones called upon to sacrifice. Here's where we address your pain points and offer solutions. The pain of hidden knowledge. Many of you wonder why these truths aren't taught in schools. The answer is that knowledge is power. The best defense against a system that profits from your ignorance is your own financial education. Seek to understand the history of money, how inflation works, and compound interest. Knowledge frees you from manipulation and gives you the ability to make informed decisions, protecting your future. The pain of system manipulation. It's understandable to feel like an elite is manipulating the system. History shows that powerful groups have always existed. The solution is not despair, but personal empowerment. By understanding how money is created and manipulated, you can make decisions that minimize your exposure to that manipulation. Build your financial independence. The pain of the current connection. History truly rhymes, and the repetition of these patterns is alarming. The solution is to be a keen, proactive observer. Don't wait for crises to happen to react. Monitor inflation, public debt, and economic news with a critical eye. Prepare for uncertain scenarios by diversifying your investments and protecting your capital. The pain of the little guy who pays the bill. You're not alone in the perception that the burden falls on the shoulders of those who have the least. The solution is to build individual financial resilience, create a robust emergency fund, get rid of high-cost debt, and invest in real assets like real estate or physical gold with caution and research, or diversified investments that protect your purchasing power. Don't be a passive piece in the game. The pain of unpegged money. The abandonment of the gold standard and the rise of fiat currency are at the root of many problems. The solution is to understand that the value of your money depends on trust. Don't blindly trust promises. Seek to protect your wealth against devaluation by investing in things that hold intrinsic value or grow above inflation. The hidden financial battle behind World War I isn't a relic of the past. It's the foundation of the present. The lesson is harsh, but necessary. Money, once unlinked from reality, becomes a tool of manipulation. Governments will always find ways to fund wars, financial bailouts and crises, and they will always find ways to make you pay for it, whether through taxes, inflation, or the erosion of your savings. Real wealth isn't just numbers on a screen or promises from politicians. Real wealth is resilience, knowledge, and the ability to see through the illusions. That is the only financial freedom that history allows. And here is the final thought to carry with us. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The financial playbook written in 1914 has been used repeatedly, dressed up in new language and presented with new justifications. But the result is always the same. Those in power protect themselves, and those without knowledge are sacrificed. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Never assume that money is real just because it's printed, and never assume that the system is stable just because the authorities say it is. The truth is always hidden in the balance sheets, and history is the only teacher that doesn't lie. If this journey through the financial history of World War I has given you a new perspective on money and power and made you feel ready to reclaim your financial freedom and protect yourself, click subscribe to the channel right now and hit the bell, because history has the answers. I'll show you where to look for them. The true revolution will not come from outside, but from within each person who decides to be no longer a pawn on the board, but a conscious player. Your education is your greatest weapon.